Have you ever noticed how, like, a really bad night of sleep doesn't just make you physically tired, but it actually makes you feel just completely emotionally raw the
Yeah.
next day?
Oh, yeah. I mean, anyone who has pulled an all-nighter knows that exact feeling of just total emotional fragility.
Right, you're just on edge. But what if I told you that intentionally keeping a severely depressed person awake all night long, like totally awake, can sometimes act as a faster, more effective antidepressant than actual psychiatric medication?
Which is just wild to think about. I mean, it sounds dangerously counterproductive when you first hear it.
It really does.
Yeah.
But welcome to the deep dive.
Hmm.
Today, we are taking a massive stack of sources ranging from like historical psychiatric landmarks to modern fMRI brain scanning studies and clinical data.
Yeah, and the mission here is to answer one fundamental question for you, which is how exactly does sleep affect mental health?
Exactly, because we really want to completely dismantle this idea that sleep is just some biological tax you pay or, a passive standby mode where you just turn your brain off for a bit.
Right. Culturally, we tend to view rest as just an absence of activity. But, well, the science reveals the absolute opposite. Sleep is this highly active, aggressively structured physiological state.
Yeah, it's doing so much work.
Exactly. It is a central driving force of our mental well-being, not just some afterthought.
So I want to jump straight into how completely backwards the medical establishment had this for like most of the 20th century.
No, totally backwards.
Right. Looking at the historical context in our sources, if you went to a doctor in, say, 1995, and you were like, I'm experiencing severe despair and I also can't sleep, the insomnia was treated purely as a symptom.
Yeah, it was categorized strictly as a downstream casualty of the mood disorder.
Like, oh, you're sad, so of course you can't sleep.
Exactly. The prevailing logic in psychiatry was that the depression was the core illness. And, if a clinician could just cure the depression, well, the sleep architecture would just naturally repair itself.
Right, they assumed the sleep issue would just go away.
Yeah, so insomnia was rarely targeted as the primary issue back then.
But the DSM-5, which is the main diagnostic manual for psychiatry, radically changed that in 2013, didn't it?
It did, yeah. They reclassified insomnia disorder as a standalone diagnosis.
Which is a huge deal.
Massive deal. It meant a clinician could diagnose it independently, even if the patient had a co-occurring mood disorder at the same time.
So what forced that structural shift? Because institutions don't just change their manuals for fun.
No, they don't. The shift was really forced by an overwhelming wave of longitudinal data. Specifically, Francesco Baglioni and his colleagues published this highly influential meta-analysis in 2011.
Right, the Baglioni study.
Exactly. They pooled massive amounts of data, tracking healthy sleepers versus those with insomnia over really long periods, and the findings were just undeniable.
What did they find?
They found that individuals with insomnia had roughly double the risk of later developing clinical depression.
Double the risk. So the poor sleep was actually predicting the mood disorder before it even happened. So for decades, doctors were essentially, well, the common idiom is that they were treating the smoke while ignoring the fire.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it.
But looking at the mechanisms described in these studies, it's almost more like an overheating car engine. Like, doctors saw a high temperature, gauge the insomnia, and assume the engine block, the depression, was simply melting on its own.
Right, they were missing the root cause.
They didn't realize the broken cooling system was actually the physical cause of the engine block melting.
That's a great analogy. The failing cooling system directly degrades the engine, which in turn generates more heat, right? And that just further destroys the cooling system.
The loop.
A vicious bidirectional feedback loop. Poor sleep degrades the mood regulation circuits, which ramps up clinical anxiety, which then chemically prevents the brain from entering restorative sleep the very next night.
Man, that is rough.
Yeah.
Which brings up the immense challenge of how researchers actually figured out how to measure that failing cooling system in the first place.
Yeah, the measurement part was not easy.
Tracing the origin of connecting sleep to our psychological life in these sources, we start with Sigmund Freud's 1899 book, The Interpretation of Dreams.
Right, a classic.
But Freud was just like using introspection and patient interviews. There were no objective metrics at all.
No, he was basically trying to deduce the mechanics of a locked engine just by listening to the noises it made.
Exactly.
And, that entire field of psychoanalysis dominated the conversation for half a century, but it fundamentally could not be tested. The empirical turn required actual physical tools.
And those tools finally arrived in 1953, right?
They did. That was when Eugene Oserinsky, who was a graduate student at the University of Chicago working under physiologist Nathaniel Kleitman, did something pretty wild.
He attached EG electrodes to his own kid, right?
Yeah, to the heads of sleeping subjects, including his young son, and that's how he discovered REM sleep rapid eye movement.
Wow. So suddenly, scientists actually had an objective, measurable proxy for vivid dreaming and mental activity.
Exactly. That discovery pulled sleep science completely out of the armchair and into the laboratory.
Right, making it a real hard science.
And by 1970, William Dement, who had actually worked with Kleitman, founded the first dedicated sleep disorders clinic at Stanford.
Which was a huge step for legitimizing the field.
Absolutely. He spent years professionalizing the field to combat the stigma that things like narcolepsy or insomnia were just forms of psychological weakness, or that people were just making it up.
Just malingering, yeah. But the sources highlight that for a long time, even in the lab, the focus remained mostly on memory and cognition, like how sleep helps you remember facts for a history test.
Right. The learning aspect was the big focus.
But the true effective neuroscience angle, meaning how sleep directly alters our emotional circuitry, that really pivots on Matthew Walker's 2007 fMRI study, The Human Emotional Brain Without Sleep.
Oh, that study is a landmark.
I was looking at his methodology, and it's fascinating. He took two groups, one well-rested, one severely sleep-deprived, put them in a brain scanner, and exposed them to increasingly disturbing images.
And the results were stark.
Yeah, the sleep-deprived group had their amygdalae, the brain's threat detection center, fire 60% more intensely.
60%. That spike in threat response is alarming, but what is far more revealing is where the functional breakdown actually occurs.
Wait, what do you mean? It's not just the amygdala going crazy?
No, it's about what's supposed to be controlling it. In a well-rested brain, the medial prefrontal cortex, which is the region responsible for logic, executive function, and regulation, it sends a strong inhibitory signal down to the amygdala.
Okay, so it acts like a brake pedal.
A literal physical brake pedal.
So the prefrontal cortex looks at the disturbing image, assesses it, and signals the amygdala to just contextualize it and calm down.
Exactly. But Walker's fMRI scans demonstrated that under sleep deprivation, that specific neural pathway degrades.
The connection literally breaks down.
Yeah, the functional connectivity is severed. The brain doesn't just feel overwhelmed, it structurally lacks the network capacity to send that inhibitory signal.
Wow.
The amygdala is redlining because the brake line has literally been cut.
So you aren't just cranky after a bad night of sleep. Your brain is physically less capable of regulating fear and anxiety.
Precisely.
That mechanism perfectly explains the feeling of emotional chaos. But, and this is where the sources throw that massive curveball I mentioned at the start, if lack of sleep cuts the emotional brake lines, then the logical conclusion is that more sleep always equals better mental health.
Right. You would certainly think so.
Yet in the 1970s, researchers like Gerald Vogel found that selectively depriving depressed patients of REM sleep, like literally waking them up every time the EEG showed REM activity, produced an antidepressant effect.
Yeah, and the phenomenon extends to total sleep deprivation as well.
Like keeping them up all night.
Yes, keeping a severely depressed patient awake for an entire night produces a rapid, noticeable mood lift in roughly 40 to 60% of major depressive disorder cases.
Okay, hold on. How does that possibly work? We just established that sleep loss severs the prefrontal cortex connectivity. How does an intervention that destroys the brain's braking system temporarily cure depression?
I know, it sounds totally contradictory. To understand the mechanism behind the paradox, we have to look at Alexander Borbely's 1982 two-process model of sleep regulation.
Okay, break that down for me.
So, the brain relies on the interaction of two things. Process S, which is the homeostatic sleep pressure, and process C, which is the circadian rhythm.
Right, the body clock.
Exactly. Process S is driven by the continuous accumulation of a neuromodulator called adenosine.
Adenosine. That's the stuff that builds up in the brain the longer you are awake, right? Creating that heavy physical hunger for sleep.
You got it. As waking hours accumulate, adenosine binds to specific receptors, progressively inhibiting neural activity.
Okay, so that's the pressure building.
Right. Now, overlay the sleep stages onto that pressure. In the second half of the night, REM sleep dominates.
That's the rapid eye movement stage.
Yeah. And REM is essentially a neurobiological theater where the brain rehearses and consolidates emotional memories.
So for a healthy person, REM is just processing the day's events, normal maintenance.
Exactly. But the prevailing theory for the sleep deprivation paradox is that for severely depressed individuals, REM sleep actually malfunctions.
Oh, interesting.
Instead of processing emotions neutrally, it acts as an echo chamber. It hyper-rehearses negative affect and despair.
Wait, really? So they're just reliving the negative emotions on a loop while they sleep?
Exactly. So by waking them up or depriving them of sleep entirely, you are aggressively interrupting that toxic rehearsal loop.
Yeah.
You physically prevent the brain from cementing the despair.
Wow. So you are hitting a hard override on a malfunctioning system.
That's exactly what it is.
But the underlying cost must be massive because you are simultaneously accumulating all that adenosine and destroying the prefrontal cortex's brake system at the same time.
Yeah, and that's why it's not a viable long-term cure. The mood lift is highly volatile and temporary. It almost always crashes the moment the patient gets a full night of recovery sleep.
Because the REM comes back.
Right. You cannot sustain the brain on a sleep-deprived high. The structural degradation eventually causes catastrophic psychological failure.
And the long-term data backs that up pretty brutally, doesn't it?
Very brutally. Rebecca Bernert and Thomas Joyner's research demonstrates that chronic insomnia and nightmares independently predict suicidal ideation and attempts.
Independently predicted.
Yes, and that risk remains statistically significant even after researchers control for the baseline severity of the patient's depression.
So bad sleep is an independent escalating risk factor for suicide. It's not just a side effect.
No, it's a driver. Clinicians today are actually trained to view severe sleep complaints as distinct, urgent red flags that require immediate targeting.
Rather than just waiting for standard depression treatments to eventually, trickle down and fix the sleep architecture.
Exactly. You have to address the sleep directly.
Because the underlying system, the interplay of adenosine, circadian timing, and REM processing is so intricate and paradoxical, our common sense solutions often just backfire completely.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's look at how our society tries to self-medicate this problem. The most universal approach has to be the weekend catch-up, right? People grind through the week on 5 hours a night and try to sleep 12 hours on Sunday.
Which is such a bad idea. The catch-up strategy operates on the flawed premise that sleep is a simple financial ledger.
Like you can just pay off a debt.
Right. While a weekend binge might clear the accumulated adenosine, relieving the immediate process S pressure, it fundamentally fractures process C.
The circadian rhythm.
Yes. You shift your circadian clock, inducing what we call social jet lag. By Sunday night, your biological clock expects you to be awake.
Which causes acute insomnia.
And that immediately cascades into Monday's mood dysregulation. Plus, the metabolic and cognitive deficits you accumulated during the week, they do not fully normalize.
They just carry over.
Yeah.
The sources also tackle the aging demographic. The prevailing cultural narrative is that older adults simply require less sleep, so waking up at 4 a.m. is just, a natural part of getting older.
That is a huge myth. The biological need for baseline sleep does not diminish meaningfully as we age.
Wait, it doesn't?
No. What deteriorates is the physiological capacity of the brain to actually generate deep, slow-wave sleep.
Oh, so they still need it. They just can't get it.
Exactly. The neural networks responsible for coordinating those synchronized electrical brain waves just degrade over time. So older adults suffer from highly fragmented sleep.
Which has to drive severe cognitive and emotional issues.
It does, yet it is so often falsely dismissed as just a benign symptom of aging.
That's tragic.
Mm.
Then there is alcohol. I know a lot of people who use a drink to knock themselves out when their anxiety is humming and they can't turn their brain off.
Yeah, it's very common, but it's terrible for rest. Alcohol binds to GABA receptors, heavily depressing the central nervous system.
So it feels like falling asleep.
It drops you into a sedated state rapidly, which mimics the sensation, sure, but physiological sedation is not natural sleep.
Right.
Alcohol drastically suppresses REM sleep in the first half of the night. Then, as your liver metabolizes the alcohol, the brain experiences a sympathetic nervous system rebound.
Meaning what? A spike in adrenaline and heart rate.
Exactly, which heavily fragments the second half of the night. You are knocking yourself out, only to throw your nervous system into chemical withdrawal 3 hours later.
Thus destroying the exact sleep stages most linked to emotional processing.
Bingo.
Okay, let's pivot to clinical interventions then. If someone has chronic insomnia, the standard advice is usually sleep hygiene. Get off your phone, stop looking at screens, make the room cold.
Right, which isn't completely wrong, but it's not enough. Blue light is relevant because it suppresses the pineal gland's secretion of melatonin, which is the hormone that signals darkness and sleep onset to the brain.
Okay, so the screens do matter a bit.
They do. But researchers like Colin Espy have demonstrated that basic sleep hygiene is entirely insufficient for clinical insomnia.
Why is that?
Because behavioral and psychological arousal, like a hyperactive nervous system, profound stress, racing thoughts, that easily overrides the melatonin delay.
So telling someone with clinical insomnia to just put down their phone is like telling someone with a broken leg to try walking on grass.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
But wait, if a patient is clinically depressed and literally lacks the neurochemical balance to regulate their mood, how can changing their bedtime habits fix the depression better than a psychiatric medication?
This is where cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia comes in, or CBTI. It doesn't just change habits, it forces physiological changes through a mechanism called sleep restriction therapy.
The sleep restriction.
Yes, by intentionally restricting a patient's time in bed to match their actual fragmented sleep duration, the therapy forces the accumulation of adenosine.
Okay, so you are intentionally building up their sleep pressure,
Yeah.
making them incredibly tired.
Exactly. It drives process S so high that the biological need for sleep eventually just overrides the conditioned clinical anxiety.
Oh, because chronic insomniacs condition themselves to associate the bed with panic.
Right. They lie awake worrying about not sleeping. CBTI breaks that neuroassociation. Rachel Mamber's pivotal 2008 clinical trial showed that adding CBTI to standard antidepressant treatment resulted in significantly higher depression remission rates than using medication alone.
That is incredible.
By physically repairing the sleep architecture, the brain regains the structural capacity to process the medication and regulate mood.
Though the sources do note a need for caution with how this science is communicated to the public, right?
They do. In 2019, independent researcher Alexei Gazay published a thorough critique of Matthew Walker's wildly popular book, Why We Sleep.
What was his main issue with it?
He pointed out overstated claims regarding World Health Organization statistics and the direct mortality links of short sleep.
Oh, so basically saying lack of sleep will outright kill you.
Right. And rigorous scientific communication requires boundaries. The verified data, the amygdala hyperactivity, the severed prefrontal cortex connectivity, the bidirectional depression link, that is profound enough.
Right, you don't need to exaggerate it.
Exactly. Because overstating mortality risks can ironically induce severe sleep anxiety in chronic insomniacs, which actively exacerbates the hyperarousal that prevents them from sleeping in the first place.
You're literally scaring them awake.
Exactly.
Which brings us to how these mechanisms operate at a macro level. Because modern society is structured in a way that actively assaults this biology. Roughly a third of adults in industrialized nations aren't getting sufficient sleep.
It's a public health crisis.
And the CDC data on teenagers is particularly concerning, showing that a massive majority of high schoolers miss the 8 to 10 hour requirement.
Well, teenagers experience a biological shift in their circadian rhythm. Their process C naturally delays melatonin release until later in the evening.
So they literally can't fall asleep early.
Right. And then forcing them to wake up at 6 a.m. for early school start times artificially truncates their sleep cycles. It specifically cuts off the dense REM sleep that occurs in the early morning hours.
So they're losing that emotional processing time.
Exactly. The RAND Corporation has actually modeled delayed school start times not merely as an educational tweak, but as a critical, large-scale public health intervention to combat adolescent depression.
That makes total sense. We see the exact same circadian trauma in shift workers, too, who force their process S awake, while their process C is biologically screaming for sleep.
Yeah, shift work disorder is a highly recognized occupational health crisis. It acts as a major precursor for clinical anxiety.
The sources also note it deeply affects military and veteran populations. For those dealing with PTSD, insomnia isn't just a byproduct of the trauma. It is an active barrier to processing it.
Absolutely. And bipolar disorder provides another stark example of this volatility. Psychiatrist Ellen Frank developed social rhythm therapy based on a really fascinating clinical observation.
What was the observation?
That minor sleep loss from a transatlantic flight, a stressful deadline, or a new baby can chemically trigger a manic episode.
Just a little bit of sleep loss can trigger that.
Yes. The sleep loss isn't just accompanying the mania. The degradation of the prefrontal cortex's regulatory brake actually ignites the manic cascade.
Wow. Reading through all of these examples, sleep really sits at the absolute center of the web. Researcher Allison Harvey frames this as the transdiagnostic model,
Yes, that's a brilliant framework.
meaning sleep disturbance isn't a unique feature of anxiety or depression or PTSD. It is the shared mechanical failure across all of them.
Exactly. And it provides psychiatry with a tremendous advantage. If a clinician can target the sleep architecture directly via CBTI or circadian alignment, they have a single, non-pharmacological lever that can elevate the baseline recovery for nearly every psychiatric condition simultaneously.
So, wrapping up this deep dive for you listening, the mission was to fundamentally reframe how we view rest. We've seen how insomnia and depression operate as a vicious overheating feedback loop. We looked at the fMRI data, showing how sleep deprivation physically severs the prefrontal cortex's brake lines to the amygdala.
Yes, cutting the brake lines.
We unpacked the bizarre paradox where disrupting REM sleep actually interrupts toxic depressive rehearsal loops, and we saw how weaponizing adenosine through CBTI restructures the brain faster than medication alone.
There's the powerful stuff.
It really is. Sleep isn't just a passive state. It is an active structural medical intervention.
But before we sign off, there is one final structural mechanism to consider tonight. It involves a brain-wide waste clearance network called the glymphatic system, heavily researched by Macon Nadergaard's lab around 2012 and 2013.
A brain's deep clean cycle. Right.
Exactly. The human brain lacks a traditional lymphatic system. Instead, during deep, slow-wave sleep, cerebrospinal fluid physically washes through the brain tissue, clearing out metabolic byproducts that naturally accumulate during waking hours.
Like taking out the trash.
Exactly. And this includes flushing away amyloid beta, which is a protein deeply implicated in Alzheimer's disease. This highly active cleaning process is vastly more efficient when you are actually asleep.
So tonight, when you finally hit the pillow, remember what is actually happening under the hood. You're just powering down into standby mode.
No, your brain is going to work.
Exactly.
Hmm.
It is physically repairing the neural brake lines, clearing out the toxic emotional rehearsal loops, and washing away metabolic waste so you don't wake up functionally incapable of regulating your response to the world. Treat that architecture with the respect it demands. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.